Hey, I'm Taylor Dorsett, and this is the Professional Technical Interviewee. Technical interviews are hard, and every company does them differently. On this show, I interview engineering leaders to see what they look for in technical candidates, and then they perform a real technical interview with me. I hope you enjoy.
Blake, Richard, welcome to the show. Thanks so much for being on. Happy Friday.
Thanks for having us, Taylor. Yeah, happy Friday.
Yeah, I'm excited. This is our first ever three-person podcast. So to give an intro, Blake and Richard both work at NoRedInk. Blake is the director of technology. Richard is the head of open source technology. And they both have, backgrounds in technology in the Chicagoland area and across the Midwest. Richard's actually now hosting the podcast that NoRedInk is putting out called Software Unscripted, which you can find wherever you get podcasts. You can find them on Twitter, everything like that. Did I miss anything?
Well, I do want to correct one thing because I got to protect that Chicago reputation. Richard is actually these days in Philadelphia, and previously he was based in St. Louis, which, while technically part of the Midwest, not as cool as Chicago. So sorry, just wanted to address that.
Wow,
shots fired indeed. Yeah.
I love it. Great. Well, I'm excited to talk and learn a little bit more about what y'all look for when you're interviewing and hiring. And I think when Blake and I first talked, he said it's been, wild just trying to get people on board. So I'm sure it's a big part of the job. Can you share a little bit about what NoRedInk does and kind of the mission behind the company?
Yeah, I'll speak to that for a moment. Now, just as a highlight, I've been at the company for a little more than 3 years, and Richard has been at the company, I think, forever. I think it was actually born with him. But anyway, so the mission of the company, as we stated, is usually something along the lines of to build better writers. And really, it's about classroom instruction for classroom English language instruction. And that breaks down into a couple of different areas, one of which is writing. That's a big focus for us. And so what we're trying to do is, what we have done, is build an application which helps teachers and students make writing and make language instruction a more central part of their experience. Richard, you may want to add to that, but yeah, that's really what we do.
Yeah, that seems like a pretty good summary.
Yeah,
I'll take it.
Great. And so important. I don't think I learned how to write at all until I was a junior in high school. And then I don't think I learned how to write well until I was at least a sophomore in college. Yeah. So it's a painful process too.
Yeah, I think it really is an underserved, I don't know about underserved, but let's say under-recognized part of professional life. I mean, we think of ourselves in terms of discipline as engineers, and it's true. But how much of our job is actually writing, hopefully well. And so I think it's a really important area.
Yeah, absolutely. Can you both share a little bit about your specific role at the company?
I'll let Richard start with that one since I've been talking too much.
Sure. So like Blake mentioned, I've been at the company for a long time, 8 years now, and I've worn a lot of different hats. And most recently, actually, this is my first week doing it. I've switched over to my title is head of open source, and basically what that means is I'm working on an open source programming language that we're hoping to be using in the next year plus. So basically, I'm working full time on that programming language. The programming language is called ROC, so roc-lang.org. Cool. Blake, you want to go?
Yeah, sure. It's pretty good. It's a great story. I just as a footnote, as Richard has been transitioning to this, speaking to those things that he did historically in his role now, we've been referring to making sure all of those areas is covered as the hat sale or Richard's hat sale. He's been selling off those hats. But anyway, so I'm the director of engineering, which basically means that I'm responsible for, and I'm head of the department presently, interim head of the department. And so that essentially means when it comes to personnel, when it comes to process, I'm the person who's responsible for making sure those areas are addressed. Most recently, that's resulted in just a lot of hiring very quickly. But it's more than that too. It's just making sure that the department is set up to be effective and deliver the software that we're trying to build. There's obviously a lot that rolls into that, but yeah, that's what I do.
Nice. And could you share a little bit about the tech stack? I was looking at some roles online, which again, you have quite a few roles you're hiring for. But it
We're
seems
hiring.
like Rails stack, but there was also some interest in like Elm and Haskell, which seems kind of unique.
Yeah, so we, as far as I know, we still have the biggest Elm code base in the world. It's like coming up on like 500,000 lines of Elm code. We have increasingly been using Haskell on the back end. So we have, I'm not sure how many lines offhand, but a bunch. And Rails is sort of like our legacy code base. Like we have a big Rails code base that we have worked on a lot over the years, but we're moving towards Haskell on the back end and away from Rails.
Nice. That's really cool. Well, in Chicagoland, that's a transition I think a lot of companies have made over the last handful of years is how do we shift away from our Rails legacy app and into something else? And I've seen more and more functional programming languages becoming that like the place to go, right? Versus Java or whatever Groupon did back in the day.
Yeah, and we don't require any background in any like functional languages or functional programming. Like we just require interest in it because that's what we use.
Yeah, nice. That's fantastic. Can you both share a little bit about your pathways into technology and how you got into it?
Yeah, I'll go ahead and start. It's I mean, we're coming up on 2 decades for me, which is, there's a lot there, but it boils down to, in college, my area of study was math, but my passion, the hobby, if you will, was always programming. I was a programmer. I was a tinkerer. And so I took a lot of CS classes, and my first real job out of college was in technology, though not as a programmer, actually. It was more along the lines of technical support. From there, I made my way into quality assurance, actually, and started leading teams in quality assurance. All the while still, using those programming skills as kind of a value add. And at some point, I was senior enough in my role at the company I was at the time where I just sort of raised my hand and said, hey, I'm going to be a developer now. And everyone was like, yeah, that makes sense. That's cool. And from there, I did that for a couple of years. And at some point we had a team that needed a manager, and I had previously been a manager, and someone was like, hey, you've been a manager before. And I was like, caught me. And from then on out, I essentially took on leadership roles. That was in fintech. And then when was it? I don't know. It was probably 7 years ago. I realized that I was not nearly excited about money as a product as my colleagues, and made the shift to ed tech for lots of reasons, but probably the biggest one, it's just a domain that I'm a lot more excited about, and I find a lot more rewarding personally.
Yeah. That's great. And I know a lot of people that have made similar transitions, right? Like maybe let's find an industry. If I have the skill set that I could probably work in any industry in, right? Why not find something that I care a little bit more about, right?
Exactly. Yeah. My elevator pitch has always been, whoever I'm speaking with, if you're in fintech or ad tech or social, whatever, your product boils down to money. At some level, it boils down to money. And my product is kids' educational futures, and I'm going to win that one every time in terms of the plus for the kind of role that you want to take on, the kind of mission you want to sign up for. But let's hear from Richard.
My path into tech. So I started programming when I was 9, and it was mainly because I wanted to make games like a lot of people did. I would make like board games and spoken word games, I guess. We didn't like formally play D&D or anything back then, but we would just kind of like talk through things and have these sort of ad hoc games. And I really wanted to make computer games. One thing led to another, and my dad got me a book, Learn Basic Now. Started programming with Forward by Bill Gates. Back in the 90s, that was a big deal. And basically, just one thing led to another, and eventually I just started spending so much time on it. It was kind of a foregone conclusion that was what I was going to do professionally someday. And here we are many years later, and that is indeed what I'm doing professionally.
And how'd you both get connected with with NoRedInk. I'm always curious how people transition from job to job, because it seems like some people are, oh, I apply for things, and then something interesting pops up, and some people are like, oh, I never applied. Someone just reached out to me, or I reached out to other people. So I'm curious about the pathway into NoRedInk.
So I'll go ahead and jump in there, since I'm the more recent addition to the team. So I was actually working for a couple of years for an ed tech company in the Chicago Loop. And in terms of just the impact that the company was, I love the folks at the company, but in terms of the impact, I was really looking for an opportunity to do something that was a little further reaching. And there were some other characteristics that I was looking for in a role. And maybe one of the biggest ones was I wanted to find a company that was dyed-in-the-wool remote first, or remote friendly. And this was in just a wildly good turn of serendipity before the pandemic. And so there weren't a whole lot of companies that were that, but NoRedInk was. And as I got to know the folks, and something I've said about jobs in general, whenever you're in an application process, whenever you're interviewing, the candidate deserves to be more and more excited over time about the company they're going to join. And the company deserves to be more and more over time excited about having that candidate on the team. And that was just the story. And I haven't looked back. I said it a second ago, and I'll say it again. I love the folks at my previous company, but for me, NoRedInk has been an upgrade in every way, and it's been great. And I've gotten to work with great people like Richard too.
Yeah, so my story is a little bit different because it was a lot longer ago. So the way that I found out about NoRedInk was I was talking to a recruiter, and they, as it happened, were for Google Ventures, and they basically were recruiting for a lot of like really early stage companies. I don't know what Google Ventures looks like these days, but at the time they were like really into like seed investments, so really really small companies. This is the fourth startup I've worked for, and I really found that I sort of liked that, like really getting on the ground floor, like have a big impact type of thing. A lot of responsibility, a lot of hours, but also a lot of impact. And all the other startups I'd worked for, of course, had gone out of business. So, I mean, I guess part of the reason that I'm still here is that, this one didn't go out of business. It's great. So basically, I was talking to this recruiter, and he talked to me about a variety of companies. Well, so first he asked me like, "What are you looking for?" And I said, "Small. Like, I really want to get in like anything like smaller the better." And so he gave me a list of companies, like all of which had 10 or fewer total employees at the time. And there were two that stood out. One was NoRedInk and one other company. And so I interviewed with both of them. And it's funny we're talking about interviewing today, but actually, one of the main things that convinced me that I should go with NoRedInk and turn down the other company was just the quality of NoRedInk's interview process. It really impressed me, and I thought like, wow, not only do I like these people that I interviewed with, I think they're really great, but also I really appreciate that they would design their interview process like this. This is the type. I guess we're pretty like-minded about how to design a good interview process. Which is pretty rare, and also I think speaks to the quality of like, well, if they've all been vetted through this process, or at least at most one of them has not been vetted through this process. Somebody must have designed it, and everybody else presumably went through it. Then that also speaks to the quality of like what their technical abilities must be. So I think that like Blake was very mission oriented from the get-go. For me, I was mostly impressed by the people and like the company. But I mean, also like I had a background in writing. I'd been like, I guess I had a side gig as a writer in the past, and like was actually building writing software for like writing novels when I applied. And yet, to me, still the biggest selling point was like the people and the company. So, yeah.
That's great. Yeah, the interview process, I mean, it's kind of the whole idea behind the podcast, but it is so interesting. I just recently changed jobs, and I forgot how frustrating it can be when you're really excited about the company, but their interview process is so poor that it's like drain, just sucking that energy out of you, right? And like you're like, okay, I'll keep going because I'm excited about this company in general, but I gotta do 4 more steps. It seems like these arbitrary things, which is I could go down a rabbit hole, but
well,
as far as Yeah.
Oh, I'll just jump in and add, one of the things we definitely try to do is make sure that candidates understand why we're doing each stage of the interview and be really transparent about that. And I find that like companies that don't do that are really missing an opportunity to help candidates understand, like, what are we looking for?
Yeah. Yeah, absolutely. And it helps candidates prep as well. You know, if you say this is the goal of these stages, okay, then I'll actually be prepared for those stages versus, hey, you're going to have a final and it's going to be 2.5 hours long and good luck. Could be anything, right?
Yeah.
As far as technical interviews, it sounds like since y'all been hiring a lot, I'm assuming doing a lot of interviews as well lately.
Yeah, I'd have to go back and look at the numbers, but in terms of candidates that we've looked at from beginning to end, what is the pass-through rate? I think for the entire process, it's something on the magnitude of 1 in 8 folks, or maybe 1 in 10 folks make it through the entire process. And in the last, I'll just speak to the last 3 months, we've hired 11 or 12 folks. So you can prognosticate what that number looks like, but it's going to be in the low 3 digits. So.
And that's all engineers. Like the company as a whole has hired even more than that, of course.
Yeah.
Wow. What are you evaluating for typically when folks are going through the interview process or the technical interview process?
So for technical interview process, I would say that the main things are basically at a baseline, like, do you know how to code? Like, do you know how to take an idea and turn it into working software? And then beyond that, there's some other characteristics that we look for that are like sort of more specific than that. Things like self-awareness, problem solving skills, like being able to get stuck and get yourself unstuck, figuring out how to communicate while you're working, like how to design a system. We have these like criteria, which I'm actually reading for. So I guess I could just go through these. So code fluency, autonomy, so being able to solve the problems yourself, self-awareness, communication, problem solving, and system design. So basically, those are we do 3 technical interviews, and each of them are designed to evaluate some mix of those. And one of the things that this isn't what you asked, but just a little slightly off topic, but one of the things that's really important to us is that we don't want our interviews to be something where you can really benefit from studying for them. We really try to make them be representative of the types of things that you would do on the job, not literally things that you would do on the job. As you'll be able to tell, this is obviously not something that literally has come up. It's definitely it's a toy problem, but it utilizes the same kinds of skills that tend to come up on the job. And so we also always look for we'll say, hey, feel free to use any resource you would normally use on the job, like Google anything you want, whatever, we don't care. But when people do that, we actually do take a look at, how are their Googling skills? Do they look at the first Stack Overflow answer and then just copy paste it without reading it? Some people do that because that's a skill, right? That's a skill that we use on the job. So yeah, those types of things. We definitely none of our interviews are at all technology specific. We actually go to explicitly try to make them not only technology agnostic as possible, but there's one interview where we actually do have a code sample, and we made I think it was more than 10 different languages versions of it, just in case, just so you can use whatever language you're comfortable with. Because basically from our perspective, what we found is that people can pick up technologies on the job. They can pick up languages on the job. That's not a problem. So we're not going to try to screen anyone out because they don't happen to know exactly the whatever, framework or technology we're using.
Sure. Yeah, that's great. Are there things from a non-technical perspective you're looking for as well? Maybe you could speak to that as well.
Yeah, Richard actually touched on those in a couple of instances, but a big part of that is communication, ability to make yourself understood, do so succinctly, do so well. There's some other characteristics that we look for, things like we use this word, and I'll explain what it means, but we use the word grit a lot. Are we talking to someone who can encounter a challenge and meet that challenge and do so, in a way that's productive, or are they easily, sort of turned aside? We look for, what are some other characteristics that we look for? We do think about mission alignment. We don't necessarily want require someone to be a true believer or something like that, but we definitely have an eye on that.
Humility.
Humility is a great one. Thank you. It's well, I'll just leave it there. Humility is really important. The ability, really honestly, to take and to hear, absorb, and incorporate feedback in some fashion or another. I've described NoRedInk as having a very strong feedback culture, and it's deeply true. Feedback is not something that's just for review cycles. It's for colleagues to talk to each other about how to improve and how to get better. And I think it's incumbent on all of us to be very good at that. So those are some of those key characteristics.
Yeah, that's great. Yeah, I mean, feedback. I feel like that the way it's presented and the way it's received, it can change the entire. I don't know how you feel about a working situation. Like I've had places where feedback was handled and received and given very well, and places where not so well. And I don't know, it changes how you just feel about the company as a whole.
Yeah, no, definitely. I find that in that exercise, communication obviously plays a big role, but I think empathy and self-awareness play a big role too. Being aware of what are my limitations, what are my what are my strengths, what am I knowledgeable about, and also being aware of how that communication may be received by the audience, whether it's feedback or any other kind of communication, really does determine, is that going to be successful? Is it going to be something that someone's in a position to be able to hear and actually act on, or is it going to be something that just sounds like empty criticism?
Yeah, absolutely. It's funny how often empathy comes up on this podcast, because I came from an industry which I consider to be extremely low empathy, right? The recruiting world, at least the third party recruiting world, and then engineering, where I think the bar is higher, but depending on the company, it could still be fairly low sometimes. So it is interesting, and again, makes a huge difference in just how someone feels about their work environment.
Absolutely.
And hard to screen for in interviews. I think on both sides, everyone's putting on their best face. It's rare you're going to necessarily see how they might react in a specific situation, right?
Yeah, for sure.
Do you have any standardized system? It sounds like there's kind of 3 technicals. I guess what's the rest of the process look like for folks?
So I'll speak to that. So we're in the middle of kind of revising our process. So I'm going to briefly summarize kind of the old process, and then I'll kind of touch on how it's changing. So previously, we had a couple of stages that we referred to. There was the initial stage, which was talk to a recruiter, talk to one of our managers, and we also previously used to use a take-home challenge that we encourage folks to time box to 2 hours, but we did away with any kind of hard requirement on that. And so that was that initial stage. Then we had a technical stage, which, encompassed 3 interviews. We then had a sort of a final stage, if you will, that had a longer interview that was a deeper dive into someone's experience, talking about, the different roles they've had over time, asking some specific questions there. And then we had what I've referred to as an executive interview. It's actually our CEO, Jeff. It was named after him. So in all of our docs, it would be like Jeff's interview, but it's really an executive interview, which is really just a 30-minute conversation. And then there were a couple of items after that, but they weren't evaluations. They were more just opportunities for folks to ask questions and get to know each other. We had a sort of a meet the team interview where you just essentially jump on a call with the team that you would probably be working with, or the folks you would probably be working with, and they have a chance to get to know you, and you have a chance to ask questions and those sorts of things. And we are one of In my experience, there are a lot of technical companies that aren't really interested in checking references. We tend to love to talk to people that you've worked with before because we find it to be a pretty good predictor of what it's going to be like to work with you. So, so that's what it looked like previously. Now, in terms of how we're changing it, we've already dropped the take home. We found that there was a lot of delay around that, and it wasn't always the most effective use of folks' time in terms of the value it provided us. We've condensed the recruiter screen, that first initial interview, and the manager interview, mostly as an attempt to an experiment and an attempt to respect folks' time. Like, there's a lot of overlap between those, and so we didn't really want to do both of them necessarily. If we could condense it to one conversation. The technical interviews were shortening a little bit. And then everything after that last interview that I described, the deeper dive, happens in parallel to all of the other processes. And so we've really tried to tighten up and shorten that process for folks in an interest to really improve candidate experience, right? Like, I don't want to take a whole bunch of someone's time for them to discover, hey, this isn't necessarily the job for me or whatever. And so, yeah, I think we've done a lot of work, and I think it'll pay off as we adopt the new process.
And now, assuming that somebody, like, scheduling permitting, it's theoretically possible for someone to, like, apply on Monday and get an offer on Friday if, like, every single day they're able to, like,
have
do
some availability.
Right. Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, that's huge if you're able to move at that type of speed. Or I say if you can reasonably, if it's from application to offer within 10 days or 10 business days, like, you think you're in a good spot. I think a lot of companies trend closer to 15 or 20, right? If you're at 10, I think you're actually competitive, especially if someone realized, I talked to 2 other companies, but I didn't even know your company existed until 2 days ago, right? And now that you can kind of catch up a little bit.
And to be clear, that's not our average. It's more like, with our streamlined process, it's now possible.
Sure.
Yeah. Actually, as a footnote here, industry average for companies with comparable makeup as ours is around 21 days. The jargon in recruiting, as I understand it, is time to hire. So that's from application to offer. The average these days is 21 days, and ours is a little higher than 21 days, depending on the role. And so that's part of the reason why we've invested a lot in trying to cut it down, not the least of which because, NoRedInk is a growing company. We're an exciting company, but we aren't necessarily a household name yet. And so we've had a number of candidates who would discover us, partway through their interview process with other companies. And I think it's just maybe, at least in the professional world, one of the smaller tragedies when someone says, I have an offer in hand, I need to act on it or not, but this other company. So yeah, and in the interest of really just improving that experience for everyone.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, I'm curious, how do you both feel in the past you've done in technical interviews? Like, maybe you're more so on the management side of things now, and Richard, maybe it's kind of interesting if you're specifically looking at startups in the past, but
Sure.
Did you feel like you were good at them, not good, somewhere in between?
I'll say 2 things about that. One is, I very strongly suspect that if I ever work for a big company, it'll, like, a really big, like, tech company, it'll be because I worked for a startup that got acquired. I don't think I would ever be able to pass an interview at one of those companies. Because I know they ask a lot of, like, algorithms trivia and stuff like that, and I just don't know that stuff. As I understand it, like, I have some friends who have done that, and if I really was determined to work at one of those companies, I would probably just spend a lot of time studying it, which really would bother me, I guess, on the level of, it seems like, I don't know, disrespectful to people's time to ask them to, like, spend a lot of time studying so that you can poorly evaluate them. But since that's how the game is played, I guess I, maybe could do that. But certainly if I were to take one right now, I would absolutely fail, like, every single, big name tech company. Having said that, it's separately true that I also have, everywhere I've ever interviewed, I've gotten an offer. So I must have passed their technical interviews. Having said that, my experience interviewing with really, really small startups, like in the early stages, with the exception of NoRedInk and maybe one other that I can think of, like in a lot of cases, I was either a co-founder or I was like their first technical hire, and so the amount of rigor that they had was not really that possible. Like NoRedInk was pretty thorough, but other companies, and now I have had a couple of non-startup jobs. Like I worked for a startup, it went out of business. When I was living in St. Louis, there wasn't a big startup culture, so it wasn't like I could just hop from one startup to another. It's like, oh, got to go work for a big company now, and I'd stay there for a couple of years and then go to another startup. So I have had some like by big company though, I don't mean like big tech company. It's like I worked for like a hospital system at one point, right? They had like quite a few programmers on staff, but they were not a tech company. They had hospitals. So basically, I have also had some experience with somewhat of the more traditional interviewing style, I guess, like outside of what you find outside startups. But I've never been asked to like reverse a linked list, which I don't think I could do off the top of my head, like in C or something like that. I guess I could stumble through it and figure it out, or like anything to do with like bee trees, anything to do with trees. I've never been asked about trees or linked lists in any interview I've ever had. But I did have one like somewhat fond memory of like I was literally doing whiteboard coding. I was physically standing in front of a whiteboard writing code on it. And this is at one of the bigger companies, of course. And one of the interviewers asked me, okay, so, and this was in Java, and he was like, okay, so what would you do if you wanted to respond to a keyboard event or something like that? I was like, oh, I would add a listener. He's like, okay, so what kind of pattern is that? I was like, oh, I mean, it's like the listener, it's like, and I started explaining how event listeners were like, yeah, but like, what's the pattern? I was like, I don't know. It's like as if you were, listening for a thing. And he's like, so almost like you were observing the thing. I was like, oh yeah, observer pattern. Like, so clearly, there was some checklist, right, where like it's the candidate must say observer pattern to like pass the interview or something. But like, I guess the guy took pity on me and was like, clearly he knows like how this works, but he just doesn't know the name of or maybe he doesn't know the name of the pattern, the design pattern, Gang of Four style. So anyway. So I guess it's simultaneously true that I think I have objectively a good track record at interviews, but also I don't think they've been at the level of difficulty, regardless of whether that difficulty correlates to being a good evaluator of people's abilities, compared to what somebody might experience at like an average tech company today.
So I think the thing I want to say about my interviewing experience is I have come out of interview processes at times and been convinced that I just crushed the interview. And I've come out of interview processes at times and thought, that was a bit of a squeaker. I don't know how that went. And I will tell you, there is a very teeny tiny correlation between the actual outcome there. And I'm saying that as much for anything for your listeners, because I imagine there are folks out there who they've just gone through an interview or they're about to go through an interview and they're feeling a lot of anxiety. And more than any specific tactical advice, the best advice I can give for folks going through that, and it's something that I've taken to heart, is it's going to turn out however it's going to turn out. It's not, I don't need to change myself to be ready to work at a company, and the company shouldn't expect to work with someone they're not excited to work about. It's more of a matchmaking process. Do the skills that I bring to the table right now, right in this moment, match what the company's looking for? And if they do, that's amazing. And if they don't, that's okay. I will talk a little bit in specifics though, because that was, beautiful general philosophy, but let's talk about specifics for a second. The last time I was interviewing for any kind of a company that involved a technical interview was actually around the time I was interviewing for NoRedInk. Here's the thing. Whenever you're interviewing for leadership roles, some companies still have technical interviews, like deeply technical interviews. And there was one company in the Chicago Loop that actually had not one, but two different coding interviews for what was ostensibly a leadership position. And the first one was essentially a take home. And it was a very interesting challenge. It was basically, here's a giant data set, do a thing with it. And I crushed that one because I used off-the-shelf software for a lot of it. I basically, no, seriously, I Dockerized an installation of Metabase and then built a little bit of Python code that answered some questions that they were looking for. And their response was like, this is fantastic. And it was a great use. Like, that's what we would really do, right? If we needed to solve that problem. Now, maybe if we needed to maintain it, we do something a little neater or a little narrower, but I did that in a very short amount of time, right? And then I did the on-site interview, which there was a technical interview there as well, even though it's a leadership position. And I'm going to take a pause and just say, if you are interviewing for a leadership position and there are technical interviews, I encourage you to ask questions. It's not a bad thing necessarily, but it may mean that the company's priorities or how they're thinking about candidates is a little weird. Because the reality is, if someone asks me to write code in my day-to-day job as a director of engineering, something has gone sideways. I don't know what it is, but something has gone sideways, which is not to say I'm a bad programmer, but anyway, that's a digression. The challenge was something broadly algorithmic, and I was using Python again for that particular challenge. And I recall thinking after the interview, oh, I really should have used list comprehensions. And in retrospect, I think that was the point of the interview. I think the point of the interview was, does this person know about this hyper-specific, or not hyper-specific, but relatively specific language construct for this language that we use a lot? And because I didn't use that, ultimately, I don't think I did well on that interview, and I didn't get an offer, which on the one hand is a bummer, but on the other hand, it didn't impact me too much because frankly, NoRedInk was my first choice at the time. So, yeah.
Well, we lucked out. I guess
I would say lucked out, but like I already had an offer in hand from a third company. And so I was just seeing if I could upgrade that situation. And I did. If I'm honest, this middle company with the interview that I think I failed was kind of on even footing with the safety company. I think about it in the same way college applicants think about schools. I had my safety job. Now I was trying to go for broke. So
I'll tell you what, once you have the safety offer, it does make interviewing easier. It feels a little pressure comes off, right? Yeah. You're not sweating going, oh, I don't know how to do this specific thing. You go, yeah, it's all right.
Yeah. I think the one thing that I do bring in interviews, and I do think I interview well, is that I have a humility about me, but I also I'm very comfortable being very vulnerable and admitting where I'm strong and where I'm not. But I also bring into that experience this kind of like confidence. Earlier I said it's going to be whatever it is or not. And I don't sweat the kind of things that I think a lot of people get anxious about. And I think that is a reason why I tend to do well with interviewing. If you can say, look, this is just an exercise, it's just a sample. If I'm a match, that's great. If I'm not, oh, well, then you come with an advantage.
Yeah. Yeah. Great. Did either of you have any type of system you use to break down a problem? Let's say you're in an interview and someone says, hey, do X, right? And you don't have an immediate solution, right? Do you have some type of process you go through to kind of break that problem into chunks and tackle it?
I don't.
I have a sort of system, but it's a very general system, and it's actually how I approach any kind of programming problem. I don't want to call it pseudocode, but it's very close to pseudocode. I write down a list of like jobs to be done or things to be done. So I say, okay, I'm starting here and I need to get there and what needs to happen in between. So I start to write kind of discrete steps for, oh, I need something that does this. Oh, I need something that does that. And once I have that list, I essentially start to turn that into code, and then I look for some kind of optimization.
Either of you all have other advice for folks going into technical interviews? Whether it's somewhere like NoRedInk or smaller, larger, somewhere in between.
You've probably already mentioned this before, but I mean the main piece of advice that I would give people, because unfortunately I just don't have any practical tactical advice for like how to pass the interview, but at some point, if the interviews go well, they're going to make you an offer and you need to decide whether you want to accept it. Part of what that decision is going to be based on is like, the info on the paper, like, okay, does this like offer meet my needs in terms of, what I'm looking for? But there's also a question of, am I going to actually like working at this company? And so the interview is, once you get the offer, you usually are about at the end of your opportunity to ask people questions about stuff. So my advice would be, if nothing else, prepare for having questions to ask people if they have at the end of interviews, or like whatever point in the process there is an opportunity for you to ask questions. Definitely be prepared for that, so that you are not sitting there saying, do I have questions? I don't know. How do you like working there? Like there's probably a list of things that are important to you, and that I guess my advice would be, think ahead to pretend they've made you an offer. Now, what do you want to know about them before you make that decision? Because once you get to the point where they made you the offer, it's probably too late to go back and ask those interviewers, like, or at least it's awkward to go back and try to ask them the questions that, as opposed to if you had them on hand, then you could find that stuff out ahead of time.
Richard actually touched on something that I've done for the last couple of job searches that I think is absolutely critical. I actually think before you even apply for a single job, sit down some quiet afternoon or whatever, find a little time and some clear headspace, and decide what are the 2 or 3 things that I'm optimizing for. Because the reality is that not every company is going to optimize for those things depending on what's important to you, or is the mission critical to you or not. It's okay. There's no wrong answer there, but you should know what actually matters. And anything that isn't on that list, though it may be a nice to have, should never be the reason why you're making a decision, right? So if you care deeply about the mission, then it goes on that list. And if you're looser in terms of your mission alignment, that should never be the reason that I think you decide to come to a company. That being said, there are always nice to have benefits if there is mission alignment, if you like the culture. For some folks, culture is really important. Okay, that goes on that list. But you asked a slightly different question, which was along the lines of, how do you prepare, I think, right?
Going into technicals.
I think one of the biggest tactical mistakes that folks make in the middle of a tactical interview is they choose, if given a choice, they choose a technology or choose an approach that they think is what the interviewer wants to see. I've seen so many folks come into interviews at NoRedInk and they're like, well, this company likes functional programming. I should clearly try to do everything in Elm. And the reality is that's not a good choice. Even if it is a good choice, there's a better choice, which is use the technology that you are most comfortable with. So if you write JavaScript day in, day out, and that's your bread and butter, use JavaScript. That's going to be the better choice, honestly. And as a kind of axiom to that, I would definitely encourage folks to spend a little bit of time just looking at the broader ecosystem than just what they've been doing with their recent job, because you should, the world is wider than whatever your job has been. And so it's always good to spend a little bit of time brushing up on the idioms of whatever language you're planning to use or you prefer, to look at the what are the current practices, and I know with JavaScript that changes every third day, but the point is, be comfortable with those idioms and those sorts of things. And if you're using a tool that you're comfortable with and you're just naturally going to do better than you would otherwise.
Yeah, worth noting that, although for us, it's the case that we don't give any bonus points whatsoever for like using a technology that we happen to use. Probably for some companies, it's different. So I don't know, like, I guess it kind of depends on the company and like what, if they say that they don't care about technology, at least in our case, we really mean it. Like, use whatever you want. We want to see you at your best, meaning at your most comfortable. Because honestly, if somebody is like, well, clearly they were out of their comfort zone in terms of this technology and they didn't do very well in the interview, but is that just because of the technology? It puts us in a really awkward position trying to evaluate your abilities if we're like, oh, well, they didn't do very well, but why? Is that because they chose an awkward technology? So like in those situations, we have no choice but to say like, well, we can't just assume they're actually much better than what they showed in this interview. We have to assume the opposite. Like, well, we don't have any demonstration that you can do this, so we have to assume that you can't. So you can avoid putting us in that position by just going with whatever you are absolutely most comfortable with. And just, because like people always say, interviews are an opportunity to show off. Like, yeah, show us, let us see you at your best, with whatever technology you're most comfortable.
Richard said something that stuck with me, and I think this is a place where a lot of interviewers or candidates, especially who haven't interviewed as much, they misconstrue something. There's nothing about our interview process that is designed explicitly as a judgment of how excellent the candidate is. Yes, we do assessments. Those assessments are not about whether you are good or bad. If I hear an interview say, "Oh, this person was really good," my assumption is that that's a shorthand for saying that I got a lot of signal out of this interview. If they say bad, my assumption is that's shorthand for I didn't get much signal. And so it's not about whether or not you're excellent or good or bad. Those words, the moral weight they carry is kind of nonsense in this context. It's rather about, is the signal sufficient to support the idea that this person would be successful here? And so, yeah, the last thing I'll say, I take Richard's point on the other companies maybe want you to use the technology, specific technology. I suspect that's true. And if that company is really important to you, then by all means, prepare for that, depending on the job responsibility. If the job says you must be, a Haskell expert, then yeah, spend some time on your Haskell. My take on it is always if someone tells me, hey, use whatever technology you're comfortable with, I'm going to take that at face value. And if they're going to judge me harshly for that, then that's a signal for me. So that's my take on it.
Yeah. Having recruited for a long time, I would say, I think most companies are on the same page where if you use whatever you're comfortable with rather than whatever you think will impress them because you know a little bit about something. But maybe do some research about Elm or Haskell or whatever it is because they use it. So when they say, have you used any Haskell? You can go, no, but I understand it's a functional programming language and here's one tidbit about it, right? At least show you have some interest in it. That might go a long way.
Honestly, from our perspective, we don't even require that. Basically, if someone says, I don't know anything about Haskell or Elm, then we'll say, oh, okay, so they're functional programming languages. They're pretty far outside the mainstream. We just want to make sure you're okay with that. Are you okay taking a job here? Let's not waste each other's time. If you're just going to start and be like, oh, this is not what I'm used to. I'm out. That's not good for anybody. So all we really require, genuinely, is interest. As long as you're open to it, great. That's all we're looking for.
Yep. I will say your time is almost better spent researching about the company. I don't know how many candidates I've seen where they're like, wait, so what's your company name? And what do y'all do? Please do the research ahead of time, because if you haven't, what that signals to interviewers, whether you intend it or not, is that this opportunity isn't something you're actually excited about. And when I talk about signal, that's kind of a derogatory signal as such.
Sure. Right. I think it also shows you're probably talking to 15 other companies that you just want on a list, right?
Yep.
Which may be true, but at least don't.
I'm never going to fault anyone for playing the game, right? There's a lot of opportunity out there, but at the same time, because we're all trying to find our way in the dark a little bit, I don't think you should fault a company for hearing that and saying, maybe this person isn't the right person.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Do either of you have a different advice or additional advice for folks who would be earlier in their career? Like maybe this is their first job search or second job search?
So I've worked with folks like that a lot. So I'm going to go ahead and jump in. The best advice I can give you is, one, focus on activities that are going to leave you feeling more confident, right? You don't need to hyper focus. You don't need to perseverate. You do benefit from doing mock interviews and those sorts of things. So if you have colleagues or folks who are in your social circle who are already working at a company, see if they'll administer a mock interview for you. Go through some of those things. Put some challenges in front of yourself and do it. Not so much to brush up on the language, just to build the confidence, honestly, because any technical interview process is ultimately in some measure time boxed. And if you're coding on your own, whether you've got a job doing it or not, there's no one breathing down Richard's neck that says, hey, you need to implement this sort in the next 60 minutes. That's not part of his job, right? And so getting comfortable under, like, with a modicum of pressure is going to pay more dividends than any language construct that you can, cram into your brain the night before the interview. So I would say find opportunities to practice just that kind of time box exercise. That's going to be really valuable. Anything that's going to build your confidence or leave you feeling confident, that's going to be valuable. And I think I'd love to say that there's something else there, but I think those are going to be the most impactful things.
Yeah, the mock interviews I think are huge, especially early in your career, because you don't necessarily know what you don't know at that point, right? And even one or two people can be like, oh, just talk a little bit more when you're going through this process, or do like a small amount of pseudocoding before you get into it. And like there's such like basic tips that I think do go a long way and clearly stand out of like, oh, this person has done this a little bit before versus like, oh, they're coming into this totally blind, right?
For sure.
Great. Well, anything else to add before we actually, I guess last question for me before we move into a break and then come back into the technical. Any interviewing horror stories that maybe folks can relate to from y'all's career? I think I've shared many in the past. I don't have any too recent ones. Nothing went terribly wrong in this most recent job search, so I think I got excited about that. So anything on y'all's end?
I have one that I think is a pretty funny one, but I'll try and whatever. It's fine. So I was interviewing, this is more than a decade ago, at a company that had kind of a 1-day interview process. So I did 4 or 5 interviews in one day. And by the end of the day, anytime you go through that, you're a little bit tired, but I knew that I had done well with the interview. So much so that the hiring manager was talking to me about how they were going to make my salary requirements work because I was looking for a little bit more. They were like, maybe you could take on this responsibility. That seems like it. So, I mean, that felt to me at the time like a signal that it had gone well. And the recruiter let me know that the CEO wanted to talk to me the next day, that they wanted to talk to me the next day. And apparently that's the pattern the company followed with offers or whatever. And so I was gearing up to come in the next day for this in-person offer because I figured I'd done well, and I had done well as it turned out. But the money was an issue for the CEO, which I didn't know. And as I was gearing up to get to their location, I have dogs. I have some pet dogs, and they don't always want to come in. And I had a situation with a dog that just refused to come into the house. And so I was a little late. I was 15 minutes late to the scheduled time. And I gave them a heads up. The rule of the road there is always communicate, right? So I gave them a heads up that I was going to be a little late. But I got in a little late and I walked into the CEO's office and I didn't know what to expect. And the first words out of his mouth were, before today, I had some questions about whether or not you were going to be the right person for the role. And I feel like those have been answered. And he was referring to me being late. And it set me back, but I recovered quickly. And I looked at him and I said, before today, I had some real questions about whether or not this role was right for me. And I feel like those have been answered today. I kid you not. I'm not even making that up. And the reality is that when I talk about matchmaking, interviewing being a match, like that's exactly what it is. Because honestly, if that same candidate were coming to me and they said, look, I was trying to get some stuff in my life sorted out. I let y'all know ahead of time. I'm sorry that I'm 15 minutes late. There was a reason. I'm not even going to remember that tomorrow. That's not that big of a deal, honestly. And anyone who cares that deeply about that, that's not necessarily someone that I'm going to want to work with. So that's my funny horror story, I guess.
That's a very strong signal, right?
Yeah, it's a really strong signal. So anyway.
So I have one that's like only partially about me. But so in one of the startups I worked for, after it went out of business, I was looking for a job. Everybody else on the team was looking for a job. And there were 3 of us who had all applied to the same company. And we all made it through the resume stage and we made it to the phone call stage. And all 3 of us got different interviewers on the phone. And I know this because the person that I interviewed with had an accent. And one of the other people I talked to said his interviewer definitely had a cold or something. And the other person said it was an American who did not have a cold. I was the only one of the three who got passed on to the next stage. Now, the reason that this is a horror story is that at the time, I considered the guy who got the interviewer with the cold to be a significantly better programmer than I was. And the fact that he didn't get, I assumed that, like, I was like, the third guy was like pretty new to programming. So I was like, okay, maybe he won't get it. And he didn't. But I was shocked that I would have gotten through and the other guy wouldn't have. So then I ended up, going on and I ended up working there. And when I was interviewing, I walked through the office and I saw there was like very loudly, clearly someone had a cold. And I remembered who that guy was. And after working there, I subsequently realized that the person that I got was one of the nicest, like most easygoing people in the team. And the guy with the cold is like, everybody knew was the meanest, like just hardest, like, and also the type of person who didn't like interviewing and just like kind of wanted to be done with it. And like, it was just luck of the dice. It had nothing to do with which of us was better at programming or our skills or anything like that. It was just literally who randomly got assigned to interview us. So at NoRedInk, we try to like minimize that by like making really, strict rubrics and stuff, and like really specific instructions for like to try to make it so that minimize the chance that the candidate like gets a different answer depending on who happened to interview them. But that always kind of stuck with me as like, this other person, like, there literally was nothing they could do. It was completely out of their control that they happened to get this other guy. And maybe they froze up or something like that. But I mean, I asked how it went. He's like, I think it went well, but that interviewer really seemed to be, unhappy. So yeah, I mean, I honestly think it was just luck of the draw. And I guess it's a reminder that can absolutely happen to you. So, don't beat yourself up necessarily if you feel like the interviewer, like no matter what you said, the interviewer wasn't going to pass you.
Yeah, definitely. And I will say, like, there's a lot to be said for organizations that put interviewers through unconscious bias training or do a lot of work around that, which we do or have done. And I think that that's really important. Like, we want to take bias. I never want to take human judgment out of the process, because the reality is that humans are really good at doing stuff that computers are horrible at, which is assessing nuance. But I also want to remove as much bias as I can from the process as possible for exactly the reason that Richard highlighted there. So two really instructive horror stories, as it turns out.
Yeah, I had one thing come to mind. So in this most recent job process, it touches on what you mentioned earlier, Blake, where sometimes, you think you did well and you don't get moved on, or you don't think you did well and you do get moved on. I had an interview for a larger tech company that I thought went mediocre at best. I think going into it, it's an industry I'm very familiar with. So the interviewer was like, "Oh, this is cool. You actually know about this industry and like have some knowledge." So the conversation was great. Technical started. Conversation did not go great after that. And then by the end, like, I got through it, but it was not. If I was evaluating myself, I would give myself a C minus, right? So I emailed the recruiter after saying, and it was a recruiter that I know personally, so say, thanks so much. This is, it was a fun interview, but like, I didn't think it went well. So, happy to talk next time around when I'm looking for a job. I didn't hear back from him at all. And I was like, that's fine. And then a couple of days later, he goes, "Oh, we want to move you to a final." And I was like, okay, well, I guess I just have no idea on what this looks like. So
I was thinking, though, I'll just share briefly from the other perspective as an interviewer. At one point, and I'm not going to discuss specifics, but I was interviewing a candidate and we had a scenario interview. I will say, if you have a scenario or a role play based interview and the candidate almost gets so aggravated that they start a verbal argument with you, that is a sign that the interview is not going well. Just as a heads up, if you feel like arguing with the person that's interviewing you, do so respectfully. That's one piece of advice.
Sure.
So,
great. Well, let's take a quick break here and then we'll come back into the technical.
Thank you for watching the first half of the Professional Technical Interviewee. The technical interview will be released 1 week from this episode, so be sure to subscribe to make sure you don't miss it. New episodes are released on the first 4 Thursdays of each month. Find us on YouTube at youtube.com/Dorsett or on Apple Podcast or Spotify. Make sure you subscribe so you don't miss out on new episodes. And remember, keep practicing.